They thought firing me would erase me. Instead, it made me impossible to ignore. No warning, no explanation, just silence, until I took their biggest client with me. This is how I turned betrayal into my own empire. You won't want to miss this story. But before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a video like this one. My name is Hana Lee. I'm 34. And for the last 5 years, I was the woman who held things together while other people took the credit. I wasn't the loudest in the room or the one with the flashiest shoes, but I was the one who stayed late, kept projects on track, soothed anxious clients, and delivered results like clockwork. So when I walked into the office that Thursday morning, and my ID badge refused to let me in, I figured it was just a glitch. I laughed to myself, tried it again, then again, before the security guard came over and asked me, too gently, to come with him. That's when my stomach dropped. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. I followed him past the lobby I used to breeze through every morning with an iced coffee in one hand and 3 back-to-back meetings on my calendar. Past the desks where people suddenly found something very interesting on their screens. Past the product wall that still featured the campaign I led last quarter. The HR rep was already waiting when I got there. Expression blank, folder ready. She used all the usual words. Restructure, difficult decision, moving in a new direction. No warning. No performance review. Just a cold termination with a severance packet and a weak smile. I asked if Colin was coming. She didn't answer. Colin, my manager, my mentor supposedly, the man who once told me I was the best hire he'd ever made, didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye. They let me take one trip to my desk, supervised, to pack up my things. My chair had already been rolled away. My monitor was dark. I looked at the mug my sister gave me, the little origami crane I kept for luck, the plant I'd kept alive through 3 product launches and 1 office relocation. I packed it all up in silence. No one said a word. No one offered to help. I wasn't just being let go. I was being erased. And yet, I didn't break. Not there. Not in front of them. I smiled, said thank you like I had anything left to be grateful for, and walked out with my head high. But inside, I was already making a list. They thought they could discard me like I didn't matter. That I would just disappear, lick my wounds, and move on quietly. But they forgot something. I was the one who closed their biggest account. I knew what made that client tick. I knew what they hated, what they needed, and what they were planning for next quarter. I hadn't just been an employee. I had been their advantage. And now, I was their threat. When I walked back through the open office with that sad little cardboard box in my arms, the silence hit louder than any firing ever could. Colleagues who used to crowd my desk for feedback or lean on me when a client panicked now couldn't meet my eyes. A few glanced up, mouths parted like they might say something, but no words came. It was like watching people slowly distance themselves from a building on fire, afraid to be caught in the fallout. I heard the whispers, though. I always do. Hana? What happened? Did she do something? Someone murmured something about budget cuts. Someone else said performance issues, but no one asked me. No one dared. I passed the mural near the elevator, the one they paid a small fortune for during the rebrand, and I remembered the meetings I ran to get it approved, and the nights I stayed late just to make sure the presentation was airtight. Now I was just background noise. Just another departure swept under the rug before the 3 p.m. client call. The intern who started last month gave me a confused look like she wasn't sure if she was supposed to say goodbye or pretend I had never been there. It stung more than I expected. Not her fault. She hadn't seen the version of me that used to light up this floor. The one who organized holiday potlucks and knew everyone's birthdays. The one who mentored the junior staff because no one else had the time. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped in alone, just me and the soft creak of cardboard, and I didn't even turn around. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing whether or not I would cry. But the sting behind my eyes was very real, not just because of the suddenness, but because it was so clearly orchestrated. No exit interview, no official statement, just a quick flick of a switch, and my name erased like a typo. They didn't want closure, they wanted silence, and I was expected to comply. I stared at my reflection in the metal doors as they closed, trying to recognize the woman who had once felt proud to walk in here. All I saw was someone disposable, replaceable, forgotten before the elevator even hit the ground floor. But what they failed to understand was this. While they saw me as gone, I had never been more awake. I knew the game. I knew the patterns. I knew exactly how much of their success had been built on my quiet labor. And I wasn't going to scream or beg for answers. I was going to do what I'd always done best. I was going to observe, plan, and execute. They fired me without warning. But what they really did was free me. And I don't think they were ready for what a woman like me does when she is finally unchained. It didn't take long before the truth slipped out. Not from management, of course, but from a friend of a friend whisper that found its way to my inbox like smoke under a locked door. Apparently, the official word was that I had been underperforming. That's what they told people. Underperforming. The same person who pulled double shifts during campaign season, who salvaged that disaster pitch last quarter when no one else could, who mentored half the junior team and wrote SOPs that were still being used long after I was gone. That was the story they stuck to. No context, no acknowledgement. Just a clean little sentence to explain away a decision they didn't have the spine to own. I sat on my couch that night rereading the message, staring at the word underperforming, like it was some kind of spell meant to erase every 3 a.m. Deck I built, every weekend check-in I covered, every ounce of myself I'd poured into a place that ultimately decided the narrative without me. I thought about the awards I had won. The framed certificate from corporate, the spotlight shout-outs during town halls, the client who once told me I saved their business. I thought about the time I skipped my cousin's wedding because of a last-minute deadline and the way I had brushed it off, saying, "This is what building a career looks like." I had believed that. Believed that if I worked hard enough, stayed late enough, took ownership without complaint, I would be safe. But safety, I learned, wasn't earned. It was granted by people who decided whether or not you were worth protecting. And I wasn't, not when things got tight, not when they needed to show movement without taking real accountability. I became a story they could control. A whisper in the hallway. A checkbox on a restructuring chart. I imagined the conversations in closed-door meetings, the ones I was no longer invited to. Let's just say she wasn't delivering anymore. She didn't seem engaged. She had potential, but maybe she peaked. They said it with practiced ease. I was sure. I could hear the cadence of their voices in my head. Because this wasn't the first time I had seen it happen. It was just the first time it happened to me. And once that switch flips, once you see how replaceable you are in a place you gave your all to, something inside you shifts forever. That night, I opened my laptop and pulled up the files I hadn't yet deleted. Notes. Proposals. Emails with timestamps that told a different story. The real story, not the one they crafted for HR reports and optics. I wasn't underperforming. I was inconvenient. I was vocal. I was powerful. And they didn't like that. So they lied. But I had receipts. And sooner than they realized, I would remind them who I really was and what I was capable of when I stopped trying to be liked. There was one name that kept circling in my head, like a steady drumbeat beneath the chaos. Chromatech. They weren't the flashiest client, not the one leadership flaunted in slide decks or passed around in press releases, but they were mine, from start to finish. I still remember the day I cold called their director, voice steady despite the script in my lap shaking slightly. They hadn't even been looking to switch agencies, just browsing, testing the waters. But something in that first call stuck. Maybe it was the way I listened, really listened, or maybe it was just the timing, catching them in a moment where someone showing up with clarity and calm made more impact than another flashy pitch. I followed up. I learned their product line. I asked the questions that didn't sound rehearsed. And over time, without any fireworks or fanfare, they became loyal. They grew. We grew with them. Eventually, that small exploratory conversation turned into a 7-figure account, consistent, stable, low maintenance in all the ways management adored, and they let me handle it quietly. No fuss. No interruptions. They didn't bother to get involved much because I had it under control, and when quarterly meetings came around, they smiled at the numbers and nodded like the success was expected, like it just happened. But it didn't just happen. I made it happen. Every relationship nurtured, every hiccup managed before it became a problem, every small win that stacked into something undeniable. And then, in one cold Friday morning, they let me go without even thinking to notify the client. That was their mistake. Because Chromatech didn't see me as a replaceable rep. I was their point of contact, their strategist, their partner, and the silence from the company after my dismissal, that didn't go unnoticed. The email came 2 days later. Short, direct. From their VP, just checking in, they said. Curious why our monthly sync hadn't been scheduled? I stared at the screen for a long time before I replied, not from company email, of course. That had been shut off immediately. I responded from my personal address, told them I was no longer with the agency, and then I waited. It took less than an hour. They asked where I'd gone. Said they hoped we could still work together, somehow. Said they valued the relationship. And just like that, the seed was planted. The client they forgot was the one I had built. The one who knew the difference between the logo on the slides and the person behind the results. They forgot the most important thing about loyalty. It doesn't belong to a brand. It belongs to the person who earned it. And I had earned it. Quietly. Consistently. Without demanding credit. Now they had to face the reality they tried to deny. They hadn't just fired an employee. They had fractured trust. And trust, once broken, does not come back to the same hands. There's a folder on my personal drive I don't talk about. Not because it's secret, but because no one ever asked how much of myself I'd poured into this work. Late nights blurred into early mornings. Slides fine-tuned to the pixel. Decks rewritten 3 times just because I felt the tone was off by a hair. I never minded the invisible labor. The extra mile that wasn't on the project brief, the weekend brainstorms that ended up shaping entire campaigns. I did it because I cared, not for credit, but for craft. And as the years went by, I started archiving everything I created that bore my signature, even if the signature was quiet. Proposals I wrote from scratch, mock-ups I designed when creative was overloaded, detailed call summaries with client insights that later became full-blown strategy. Some of it started on the company server, sure, but I always copied it to my drive before it got swallowed by someone else's version. Because I knew what this industry does. I'd seen it. I'd watched colleagues disappear, their work absorbed into team decks, their names erased like they'd never been there. I wasn't going to be one of them. So I saved. Not out of paranoia, but out of instinct. Every idea, every tweak, every slide that had my fingerprints. I didn't steal anything. I documented what was mine. The raw thoughts, the frameworks, the unpolished drafts that never got greenlit but still mattered. When they cut me loose, they assumed I'd vanish quietly, that I'd walk out with nothing but a cardboard box and wounded pride. But I walked out with a portfolio, not in a flashy binder or zipped USB, but in a digital folder I'd been curating like a memoir. My name was on every page, sometimes in the metadata, sometimes in the margins, always in the voice that clients remembered. That was my leverage. Not just a body of work, but proof of consistency, innovation, loyalty, proof that I had been the architect while they played at being the face. And when the time came to move forward, to speak to clients or future partners or even lawyers if it ever came to that, I had something no NDA could erase. I had receipts. I had history. I had evidence that I wasn't just part of the team, I was the engine they'd taken for granted. The folder was never about revenge. It was about identity. About refusing to let a company's silence write the ending to my contribution. They thought they were erasing an employee. What they failed to see was that I had been quietly building an archive of truth. And truth doesn't vanish when you deactivate a login. It waits. And when called upon, it speaks louder than the spin they tried to sell. I waited a full week before sending the message, not because I was unsure, but because I knew once I opened that door, there was no walking it back. The wording was deliberate, calm, professional. I'm no longer with the company, but I'd love to explain why. That was it. No bitterness, no accusations, just the kind of sentence that hints at a story behind it, the kind that makes you curious if you've ever trusted someone with your money, your brand, your reputation. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. I stepped outside, heart pounding like it used to before big presentations, and picked up. What the hell happened? That was how he opened. Not even a hello. And I knew then that this call would shift more than just my week. I told him the truth. Not the embellished version, not a rehearsed sob story, just the facts how I had been let go without warning, labeled as underperforming despite the data showing otherwise, how I had built his account from the ground up, how my proposals, strategies, and long nights were suddenly reduced to a disposable line item. I didn't beg. I didn't pitch myself. I just answered every question he asked with clarity and composure. And when I finished, there was a pause. Not long, but heavy. They didn't even tell us, he said. We had no idea. I could hear the anger crackling beneath his words. The realization setting in that trust had been broken not by me, but by the company that assumed they could cut ties and no one would notice. He asked me for a copy of the original rollout plan I had shared months ago, the one they had claimed as a team effort. I told him I still had it, that it was mine, and he said, "Send it, and let's talk about next steps." The call didn't end with fireworks, it ended with clarity. A quiet, simmering shift that felt like someone pulling a chair out from under the people who thought they couldn't be touched. I stood there after, still holding the phone like it had weight, like it had become something more than just a device. It had become my line back in. Not through a job offer, not yet, but through the validation that I hadn't imagined my worth, that someone on the other end of those emails and decks and brainstorms had seen me. The company had forgotten the power of relationships, of consistency, of follow-through. But the client hadn't, and now the game was different, because I wasn't trying to go back. I was moving forward, and I had just been handed the map. The first thing I did after hanging up with the client wasn't celebrate. It was double-check. I wasn't naive. I knew companies like the one that fired me without warning didn't always play fair, and I wasn't about to step into something only to find a legal tripwire waiting underfoot. So I dug into my files, every onboarding document, every HR packet, every signature page I had ever initialed, and what I found was silence. No non-compete, no NDA, not even a clause that loosely resembled one. I stared at the blank space where their restrictions should have lived and felt a slow, rising heat of possibility crawl up my spine. Still, I wasn't about to rely on a gut feeling. I paid a lawyer to look everything over. He took a day, called me back, and said the words I'd been hoping for. "You're in the clear." That was it. Green light. All those meetings I'd been told to take notes in, all those strategies I'd been left to execute alone, all the insights I'd gathered and refined with no credit, they were mine now. Not because I stole them, but because they never thought I mattered enough to protect against. They assumed I'd just fade, that someone like me would take the hit and vanish into some lesser version of herself. They were so confident in their dismissal, they forgot to close the back door. And now I had every step, every contact, every timeline memorized. I wasn't planning to recreate their company. I was building something different, cleaner, sharper, focused on the very thing they had ignored. Relationship, clarity, trust. I didn't need to announce anything. I just needed to move quietly and with purpose. And that's exactly what I did. I reached out to a few connections softly, with curiosity instead of desperation, and I let my work speak for itself. The reaction was swift. Some replied with confusion, not understanding how I was free to operate. Others asked directly, "Didn't you have an NDA?" And every time I smiled and said, "Nope," they forgot. Those two words carried more power than I'd expected. Not because they made me invincible, but because they reminded me of how careless they'd been, how easily they'd discarded me. And now, I was using their oversight as my foundation. Every bridge they tried to burn was still standing. They just didn't notice I'd walked away with the blueprint. I wasn't trying to burn anything. I was building. And as the messages started rolling in, as the calendar filled with names I used to chase and now saw chasing me, I realized something simple and undeniable. They hadn't just underestimated me, they had equipped me. All I had to do was turn their negligence into my strategy. And that's exactly what I intended to do. The meeting wasn't supposed to be a pitch. I told myself that on the way there, like a mantra, gripping the steering wheel tighter every time doubt crept in. I wasn't there to poach anyone or sling mud at the people who let me go like I was disposable. I just wanted to talk. Just wanted to explain what happened, answer their questions honestly, and maybe if I was lucky, salvage a little of the professional respect they'd once had for me. The lobby felt colder than I remembered, the receptionist friendlier. That's how it always is, isn't it? Politeness in place of memory. When I was led into the conference room, the CEO stood to shake my hand, the kind of firm grip that signals both welcome and warning. I sat across from him, notepad unopened, hands folded on the table, and waited. I didn't start with bitterness. I started with facts, numbers, timelines. The email thread I'd printed and highlighted, I talked him through how the transition had gone down, the silence, the lack of explanation, the convenience of the lie they told about my performance. I could see the disbelief shifting into irritation with every word. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't need to. Truth has a way of settling in the room like a fog. You don't have to blow it around for it to change the air. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "So what now?" I hesitated. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I hadn't planned to share it yet. But something about the way he asked, curious rather than transactional, made me open my folder. I slid a few pages across the table. A prototype. A roadmap. The first breath of something new. I told him I'd been working on it for a while. A consulting idea. Leaner, more agile. Focused on outcomes rather than noise. I didn't sell it. I just showed him what it could be. He didn't look through it right away. Just stared at me for a long moment, then said, "And where are you taking this?" I smiled, because I didn't know whether to feel proud or terrified, and said, "Nowhere. Yet." It wasn't a threat. It was a placeholder, and he nodded like he understood what that really meant. He said they'd been frustrated lately, feeling neglected, overlooked, that things had changed since I left, and then he asked if I'd let him know when I decide. I said yes, stood up, and shook his hand again. On the way out, I passed by my old firm's logo printed on their monthly report in the waiting room. I didn't tear it down. I didn't even flinch. I just looked at it and thought, they'll know soon enough that this wasn't revenge. It was realignment. And sometimes, the best pitch is the one you never intended to make. Filing the paperwork felt both smaller and larger than I thought it would. It wasn't some grand cinematic moment with swelling music or fireworks in the background. It was just me at my kitchen table, laptop open, legal tabs side by side with a mug of reheated coffee and a half-eaten protein bar. I typed slowly, double-checked everything 3 times, and hovered over the submit button like it was a detonator. And then I clicked. Just like that, I had a name. Not a borrowed brand or someone else's logo behind my email signature. Mine. A consultancy built from experience, not ego. No glossy brochure or downtown address. Just a URL I'd been quietly reserving and a deck I'd revised at least 15 times. I didn't hire anyone full-time. That was never the point. I reached out to the people I'd worked with before the ones overlooked in meetings, cut off mid-sentence, told they needed to tone it down or slow it down or stop trying to change everything. These were the same people who had whispered thank you in Slack messages after I defended their ideas or redirected credit where it belonged. A designer in Portland, a strategist in Singapore, a copywriter in Detroit who always turned things around in half the time and with twice the polish. I sent them quiet messages. Want to build something with me? No promises, no pressure, just potential. Every single one said yes, not because I was their boss, but because they believed in the way I worked. The name I gave the company didn't reference me. It wasn't about ego. It was about clarity and results. We didn't need an office. We didn't need dress codes or company retreats or mission statements laminated in conference rooms. We needed good work and a place to do it. And that's exactly what we made. I didn't announce it on LinkedIn. I didn't send a mass email to former colleagues. I let it breathe quietly, like an ember. The kind that waits for the right wind. What surprised me most wasn't how fast things moved, it was how natural it all felt. Like I hadn't started something new, but finally stepped into something I'd been building in pieces for years. Every long night, every gaslit meeting, every client conversation I carried on my back while someone else took credit. It all led here. And as I sat back, the registration confirmation glowing on my screen, I didn't feel revenge. I didn't feel validation. I felt ready. Because now, if someone wanted to work with me, they'd have to come through the front door of something I owned. And I would answer not with apology or permission, but with the calm certainty of a woman who no longer needed anyone's approval to begin. It started with a single sentence in a press release, tucked beneath the usual fluff about strategic realignments and market agility. But I saw it immediately, and so did they. The client had officially severed ties with my former employer, not next quarter, not in a phased transition, but effective immediately. No heads up, no bridge building, no carefully worded justification to soften the blow, just gone. The silence that followed was short-lived, like the stunned pause after a glass shatters in a crowded room. Then came the noise. Phones ringing off the hook, department heads scrambling, Slack channels lighting up with red exclamation points and confused GIFs that did nothing to mask the panic underneath. I was no longer in that building, but I could feel the heat of it from where I sat, watching the unraveling through secondhand texts and screenshot snippets forwarded to me by people who had once stayed quiet and now wanted me to know they were watching. The CEO didn't make a statement. He sent a curt email with phrases like unfortunate timing and mutual decisions, but anyone who knew the client, who knew the years I had poured into that relationship, understood that this wasn't mutual at all. This was intentional, surgical, and they knew my name was behind it. For years, I had walked those halls invisible in all the ways that mattered, praised in performance reviews but passed over in boardrooms, told I was valuable but never irreplaceable. Now, without lifting a finger or raising my voice, I had become the variable they couldn't control. I didn't gloat. I didn't post cryptic memes or subtweet anyone. I poured another cup of coffee, adjusted the brightness on my screen, and got back to work. Meanwhile, their leadership team called emergency meetings, trying to plug the hole with new proposals and apologies wrapped in corporate lingo. But it was too late. Trust doesn't slip away overnight. It erodes quietly until one day it's just gone, and no amount of scrambling can glue it back together. I heard later that someone actually cried in the war room, not because of the lost revenue, but because they realized too late what I had carried for them, how much weight I bore without recognition or support. That was the part they hadn't calculated, the loyalty that doesn't show up on balance sheets. They had underestimated me, and now they were paying for it in full. And me, I didn't have to raise my voice to be heard anymore. My absence had become my loudest statement. The silence they once imposed on me had finally cracked, and what came rushing in wasn't just noise, it was consequence. And from where I sat, building something new, I finally understood what power really looked like. It was never in their titles or corner offices. It was in the quiet precision of knowing exactly when to walk away and exactly where to walk next. It started with a ping from Olivia, just 3 days after the client's announcement went public. No greeting, no small talk, just a quiet message that said, "Hey, are you hiring?" I stared at it for a while, the cursor blinking underneath her name like it was waiting to see who I would be now. The version of me no longer bound by their rules or afraid of their silence. Olivia had been a senior strategist, someone who used to sit 2 rows down from me, her brilliance dimmed by a manager who only saw her as a note-taker with good shoes. A few minutes later came the next one, from Marcus, who had left 6 months before I did, under the foggy excuse of realignment, even though everyone knew it was code for disposable. He said, "Can we talk?" And I could feel in the weight of those 4 words what he wasn't saying, the exhaustion, the readiness, the quiet fire waiting to be given direction. By the end of the week, I had 3 messages from 3 different corners of the building I used to call home, and all of them carried the same undertone, not bitterness, not even revenge, but this deep, steady hunger to do meaningful work again. None of them asked me for a job outright. They asked if I remembered what they could do. They asked if I believed in what we could build, and I did. I remembered Olivia's mock-up that once saved a dying pitch. I remembered Marcus staying late to fix data because no one else cared enough to get it right. I remembered all the side conversations, the late-night emails, the quiet brilliance that bloomed in shadows because no one at the top had taken the time to look. So I invited them in, one by one, not to recreate what we'd left behind, but to start something that made space for everything we had been denied. We didn't talk about titles. We didn't worry about corner offices or formal onboarding. We talked about value, about impact, about freedom. It was strange at first to be the one people looked to, not just for approval, but for vision. But it was also natural, like stepping into clothes that had always been mine, just hidden in the wrong closet. They had underestimated me, yes, but they had underestimated all of us, and now we were the ones holding the blueprint. Not for revenge, not for ego, but for something better, something earned. When we met on that first call, 4 rectangles glowing against the dark, I said the only thing that felt right: they didn't see us. But that doesn't mean we weren't building. And everyone nodded, because they knew exactly what I meant. The kind of team that forms not in celebration but in aftermath. The kind that doesn't need permission anymore, only a reason. And we had one. We had plenty. It came in like a mosquito bite masked as a legal threat, sharp and pointless, an email stamped with corporate bravado and empty teeth. Cease and desist, it read in bold, like I was supposed to flinch at their recycled language and paper-thin threats. I read it twice, just to be sure, then once more out loud to my dog, who blinked at me like even he knew they were bluffing. They claimed I was soliciting clients improperly, that I was violating intellectual property, that my actions were damaging their reputation. But the reality was simpler, cleaner, and far less dramatic than the fiction they were trying to build. The client had come to me. I hadn't made a single offer, not one pitch, not one back-channel attempt. I had merely sat across the table, showed them what I had been building, and let them decide where they saw their future. And they chose. Not because of loyalty, not because of pity, but because they believed in the work. Because they remembered who had shown up when deadlines loomed, and who had stayed silent when their needs were minimized. I had all the documentation to prove that every piece of strategy was mine, created off hours, on personal time, with my name etched into every slide deck and summary. I had verified with a lawyer before lifting a single finger, had every message, every timestamp, every dotted line vetted. I wasn't scared of their email. I was insulted by it. Not because they tried to intimidate me, but because they still thought I was the kind of woman who would crumble at bold font and veiled consequences. I sent back a response that was 2 lines long. No drama, no extra flourishes. My attorney has reviewed this. No violations were made. Best of luck. That was it. No fear, no retreat. And after that, there was silence. Not the powerful kind, not the intimidating kind, but the stunned kind, like a child caught in a lie that landed flat. The client remained exactly where they were, committed, vocal, and even more determined to see my new consultancy succeed. They sent a message later that day saying, "We stand with you," and I believed them, because standing with someone after the storm is easy. But standing with them when the rain starts falling, when the pressure mounts, when the power structure bares its teeth, that's when truth reveals itself. And mine did, loudly. I didn't win because I fought dirty. I won because I never needed to. Because when people operate from fear, they expect others to do the same. But I wasn't afraid of what they could take from me. I already knew what I could build on my own. And that email, meant to shake me, only proved one thing. They were scared. And they should be, because I was just getting started. It hit the inbox at 6:43 a.m., tucked between a digital receipt for oat milk and a promo email from a skincare brand I never unsubscribed from. But I knew the second I saw the subject line. Strategic shift, top client walks, follows fired strategist to new consultancy. I clicked before I finished breathing. There it was, my name in bold. My face, professionally lit and confident, staring back at me with a kind of satisfaction I didn't need to fake. The article laid it out clean. No speculation, no euphemisms. The client I had built from a cold lead into a cornerstone account had terminated their contract with my former employer and transitioned to working exclusively with my new firm. The reporter had done their homework, citing timelines, campaign performance data, and even anonymous comments from industry insiders who described my departure as a strategic misstep with long-term consequences. They didn't just report on what happened. They named the firm. They named me. And suddenly, what had been a quiet exodus, a slow burn of justice behind closed doors, was now public record. I could already imagine the boardroom scramble, the Slack messages pinging like alarm bells, the panicked PR drafts trying to figure out how to spin losing their biggest account to someone they had fired without a second thought. The article quoted the client's CEO directly, a sentence that read like music and thunder all at once. "We trust people, not logos." She was the relationship. No one could spin that. No one could pretend this was coincidence. This wasn't a quiet win anymore. This was a broadcast. And the best part was, I hadn't lifted a finger to get it published. Someone in the industry had noticed, connected the dots, and done what good journalists do. They told the truth. The kind that makes ears burn and coffee cups rattle in clenched hands. I posted it with no caption, just the link. And within minutes, the likes started pouring in, followed by direct messages, some congratulatory, some curious, some cautious. But the ones I noticed most were the ones that didn't come. The people who had laughed when I was escorted out. The ones who stayed silent while I rebuilt in the dark. The ones who had said nothing and now had nothing to say. My inbox became a flood of opportunity. Collaboration offers, podcast invites, speaking engagements. Suddenly, I wasn't the woman who got fired. I was the woman who rose. The woman who didn't disappear quietly. And maybe that was the part that stung the most for them. Not just that I won, but that I made it look effortless. Because sometimes, revenge doesn't need to scream. It just needs to be printed in glossy ink, stacked on a conference room table, passed from one trembling hand to the next. A story, a headline, a reckoning. And I was the one they named. The celebration wasn't loud. It didn't involve clinking glasses, engraved awards, or an expensive dinner with a skyline view. It looked like this instead. Me, sitting at my kitchen table, still in my hoodie from the night before, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of tea that had gone lukewarm an hour ago, blinking at the screen in front of me as the confirmation emails came in one by one. Contracts signed, first payment deposited, independent accounts set up, my name, not theirs, in every subject line. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't post a motivational quote about rising from the ashes or some sanitized version of my journey for LinkedIn clout. I just sat there, breathing, letting the quiet wrap around me like something earned. The dishes were still in the sink. The mail still needed sorting. My cat had taken over the armchair in the corner like he paid rent. Nothing looked different, but everything was. I wasn't working for anyone else's dream anymore. I wasn't building someone else's reputation while being told to smile more and stay in my lane. I had my own lane now. One I had paved with every ignored idea, every late-night proposal no one read, every patronizing pat on the head from people who couldn't see past my title. The irony wasn't lost on me that they had wanted me gone so badly, and in doing so, they had handed me the only thing I ever needed, a reason. I opened the group chat with the freelancers I had been quietly mentoring and simply typed, "We're live." No gifs, no over-the-top exclamation points, just that. And the replies rolled in, fast and fierce. We were a team now, not because a company told us we were, but because we chose each other. Because we had been underestimated, undervalued, and overlooked for too long. I looked around my apartment and realized that this table, this space, this life was enough. I didn't need a corner office. I didn't need a plaque with my name etched into it. I had my work, my people, and my freedom. And maybe that kind of success didn't get its own headline or catered lunch, but it felt more solid than anything I'd ever felt sitting under fluorescent lights pretending I belonged. I leaned back in my chair, let the silence stretch, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. The work would come. The pressure too, but so would the joy. The agency, the power in knowing I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I had chosen myself. And in that still moment, with nothing but quiet around me and everything ahead, I knew I didn't need champagne to celebrate. I just needed this. My name, my terms, my table. I think about it sometimes, not in a bitter way, but the kind of quiet remembrance that surfaces on long walks or in the pause between tasks when the world gets still enough to let truth in. They didn't just fire me, they tried to erase me. Tried to scrub my name from the record like I had never mattered, never contributed, never fought tooth and nail to bring in the client that paid for their raises and retreats. It used to keep me up at night, the way they smiled to my face while writing me out of their future behind closed doors, like I was a name on a spreadsheet rather than a human being with ambition and history and receipts to back it all up. But now, from where I sit, the view is different. They didn't erase me. They freed me. What they saw as disposal was actually release, and what they meant as punishment became the permission I didn't know I needed. They fired me to make an example, but I became a warning instead. A living, breathing reminder that the people you overlook are often the ones building something right under your nose. And the story didn't end where they thought it would. It didn't end with me spiraling or begging for second chances. It didn't end with shame or silence. It ended here, or rather began here, with me standing taller than I ever did in their hallways, louder than I ever was in their meetings, fuller than I ever felt in their approval. I am not the version of myself they reduced me to. I am the version I rebuilt from scratch. The one who turned humiliation into leverage, dismissal into momentum, pain into purpose. I've learned that success is not the corner office, or the padded title, or the applause at team meetings. Success is sleeping through the night without rehearsing fake apologies. It's sending emails with your own name at the bottom. It's walking into a room and not shrinking to fit the corners. It's being able to say, without flinching, I know what I'm worth. And I know who tried to convince me otherwise. When people ask how it all happened, I tell them the truth in 5 words. They underestimated the wrong woman. Everything after that is just logistics. I don't need their validation, and I never needed their permission. I have my work, my integrity, my future. And when I look back, I no longer see the day they fired me as an ending. I see it as a plot twist, one they never planned for, one they still pretend didn't happen. But I happened. I left with nothing and built everything. And this, right here, on my own terms, is the ending I wrote myself.